of the show for today. But it is Dr. FHarris, who is the president of American Baptist College. And of course, Dr. Harris, we were sort of confused in reference to whether we're dealing with the second or the segment or the third segment. But let's have you two continue our conversation earlier to talk about the civil rights movement and to talk about the separation of the races in the southern parts, well, the separation of the races that created that movement.
Yes, well, American Baptist College is a good example of how Southern culture and racism impacted black life, from religious life to economic and political life, is that blacks were not accepted on the same level and basis in community, in economic education institutions as were whites. And they were relegated to inferior lifestyles and less political and economic privileges. So what ended up happening was there were creations of institutions like American Baptist College for blacks to attend, and other interests in people establishing institutions where blacks could get training, like at Fisk and at Tennessee A&I at the time. But all these institutions represent an effort to have a place for blacks to be trained and to get education, separate apart from white culture and white privilege and white power. But what ended up occurring in terms of the civil rights movement was that these places, though they were seen as inferior and treated differently and given less economic substance and support by the dominant culture, they ended up being incubators to produce some of the great leaders that we are celebrating today, and some of the great leadership that Nashville itself has experienced. And so segregation certainly affected the way in which our culture developed our communities. And that in itself proved to be a very, very hard thing in terms of the oppression that a lot of families, a lot of communities had to suffer, and therefore a lot of people who could have been educated, who could have reaped benefits from other accesses to other places, did not. And the poverty and the lack of education, the lack of jobs, all of that was a part of this segregated culture that the South, and particularly here in Nashville and other places, we saw happen. And it was a tragic time and a tragic history. But I'm always thinking, as I think about now, the civil rights movement and what it meant for the progression of black life and the progression of this nation towards social justice, is that it never meant for these communities to be eliminated, or these communities not to have a distinct contribution, but it meant that they ought to have equal access to the economic and political empowerment that the rest of the community had, in order that it might produce the kind of families, the kind of religious institutions and educational institutions that our community needs. And American Baptist College fits right into that vision, because it's not an inferior institution. It's not an institution